I'm your host Will. We all love the king of the monsters, Godzilla, don't we? So much so that ever since he first appeared on the big screen, there have been a wave of similar films with similar creatures. And in this video, we're gonna go over 10 such films that you should all watch. Let's get to it!
The Monsterverse movies have spawned a franchise that doesn't feel like it's gonna stop anytime soon. But if you go back to the early days, it's the Godzilla movie and its success that allowed for more and more monster flicks with a similar theme, delving deeper and more philosophically. I love these features, and some of the Godzilla knockoffs actually made it into the franchise's larger expansion in recent years, which almost feels like a union and acceptance of where it all began. Let's take a look at some of the best and must-watch Godzilla knockoffs that ended up carrying their own legacy. Please note that some of them have a very interesting production story, tapping into the desperation to make something like Gojira himself. Pulgasari, 1985. Pulgasari, the supposed remake of the 1962 South Korean film titled Bulgasari, might have a lot more to do with being the idea of a knockoff Godzilla more than you realize. The only place where this monster differs from the nuclear origins of Gojira is the fact that Pulgasari was created by the oppressed people themselves. Originally, a small creature that fed on iron, it grew with the uprising and soon became a symbol for the powerless in the feudal Korean landscape. The design of the creature itself reinforces the idea that it carries, the bull-like horns and heavy body. But what makes this project much more than that is the story behind its production, one that definitely deserves a video of its own. At least, I feel so. So, Pulgasari is based on Korean folklore and is a remake of the 1962 South Korean film Bulgasari, like I mentioned. But the story of the 1985 film actually begins with the 15,000 to 20,000 film titles collected by the then ruler of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. The man wanted to capitalize on the success of the 1984 film The Return of Godzilla, and he had Shin Sang-ok and his wife Choi Yoon-hee kidnapped in 1978 and held captive, so Shin was picked as the director. Yep, the next time you want to make your favorite superhero movie, just kidnap a director and force them to do it at gunpoint. But there was some success with this film following its release. Firstly, Shin and Choi escaped North Korea and fled to the US. The movie was originally released in North Korea, but it was soon banned due to Shin's escape from supervision. It later on had a VHS release in Japan with some strong comparisons to Godzilla, because it was also released in 1998. In fact, Pulgasari might just be one of the most widely seen North Korean films and was soon labeled a cult classic. Quite the story. Not a usual one for an everyday Godzilla knockoff. Reptilicus, 1961. Now that we're done with a North Korean take on the genre, here comes one from Europe, particularly a Danish-American co-production, a film that had two versions, often mistakenly considered to be the same film released in two different languages because of the hugely similar cast. Reptilicus was released in Danish in 1961, and the following year, it saw an English language release. Before we jump into that confusion, let's get into the creature features creature here, namely Reptilicus. Unlike the Godzilla concept of awakening, this creature was actually reconstructed. Reptilicus was discovered as a frozen prehistoric fragment, particularly the tail, which was later regenerated through scientific intervention. Yes, the entire creature is regenerated from just a tiny piece, something that is basically the core of the film, because, as you see, the creature couldn't be killed by everyday means. It has the potential to become whole again. Even the film's ending relies on the same theme, as we see the creature's leg blown off earlier in the movie, moving on its own. Yep, they were sure cooking something. The production in this case was another interesting tale, as filmmakers Paul Bong and Sidney Pink shot their parts of the film simultaneously, resulting in two different films with an almost entirely different cast, including the Danish actors speaking English with their heavy accents. Oh, the Americans made sure they were dubbed before the 1962 release. Now, even though the film heavily borrows from the American creature feature and Japanese kaiju film genres, it didn't have the industrial infrastructure that powered either genre. But what it does have is extensive on-location shooting, with a primary focus on Copenhagen itself, using the opportunity to ground the spectacle in real urban spaces. So, instead of sticking to the nuclear allegory, they really dived into a biological anomaly based in Copenhagen. Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, 1995. This 1995 film was supposed to mark a reboot of the Gamera franchise, going back to its early days, almost like a sibling to Gojira himself. I mean, the name Gamera comes from kame, which means turtle in Japanese, and the suffix ra is shared by both Gojira and Mothra. Funnily enough, the franchise was supposed to contend with Godzilla, something that the executives back in the 60s were against, but Masaichi Nagata stood by his decision. But that's enough about the 1960s original version. Let's talk about the reboot, the one that was supposed to bring this Gojira competitor to a larger global audience. Once again, we are introduced to the giant turtle creature with huge tusks, said to be inspired by the black tortoise, one of the 4 symbols of the Chinese constellations in East Asian mythology. This creature is awakened by a major collision with a ship carrying plutonium, as scientists discover the rise of the unknown. But this rise is not for an ordinary cause. It is also to protect the world from the Gyaos, giant birds attacking several villages. According to the lore, the Gyaos are the result of rampant environmental pollution, and Gamera was created by an ancient civilization in response to them. But the real detail that becomes essential to the story is the way that Gamera is spiritually linked with a kid through an amulet, an essential detail that makes the narrative much more human, and one that has also become a major part of the recent Monsterverse arc. In the end, Gamera takes on the idea of the monster being neither a hero nor a villain, but something that corresponds to a systematic balance, something that protects, but the method can also inflict damage of an equal measure. Gorgo, 1961. Now let's go back in time again, to the year 1961, when the effect of the kaiju films was something that every industry or production house was reeling from. But if you go through this one, it almost feels like a mix of the kaiju and its enemy from Skull Island. Gorgo follows a ship searching for treasure, dealing with a volcanic eruption, and then encountering a gigantic creature linked to some of the Viking relics they find. And what did these humans do with the creature? Well, they captured it, brought it back home to London, where it's then exhibited for the public in Battersea Park. But then comes the twist. The scientists discover that the creature is merely an infant, and, along with the waves, Gorgo's mother emerges, looking for her offspring. In the end, they are reunited and head back to the sea. The creature fits into the narrative as something controllable, particularly the infant creature. Even though its appearance is heavily borrowed from our favorite kaiju, the creature is kept grounded, with no other abilities like energy beams. So once again, the narrative is about not disrupting the natural order of things, something the humans tend to do a lot, resulting in some major franchises. But the concept is more about reversing the kaiju logic, framing it as a threat provoked by human interference. War of the Gargantuas, 1966. Now we're back to Toho, the one that gave birth to the kaiju. And this 1966 film is also directed by Ishiro Honda, the man behind the 1954 Godzilla. Once again, we get to witness the detailed miniatures and the suitmation along with the brilliant destruction sequences, resulting in something that is all about internal contradiction leading to a catastrophe. How? Well, the Frankenstein-esque monsters in this film are genetically related, with one brown and the other green, named Sanda and Gyra respectively. Now, Sanda is the composed one, trying to avoid human conflict. But Gyra, he's the bad guy, cannibalistic in nature, and the film deals with the conflict between them. In fact, the next film on this list is considered to be a loosely based sequel to our next feature. So, let's go directly to our next must-watch knockoff. Also, don't pass these movies off as knockoffs, because they definitely deserve a lot more attention than the term knockoff can give them. Most of these movies have become cult classics. Frankenstein vs. Baragon, 1965. Directed by Ishiro Honda, this film is considered to be one of the first collaborations between Toho and Henry G. Saperstein, resulting in an international co-production between the US and Japan. This one is directly linked with the Hiroshima nuclear attack, as the events of the bombing are followed by 15 years later, with a boy running rampant through the streets and consuming small animals. It is soon discovered that this boy has developed a strong resistance to radiation, and that's where we have our Frankenstein. Yeah, it's not Frankenstein's monster for those planning to correct it, because the people saw how the boy had now become a giant and ended up naming him so. But around the same time, strange earthquakes near Hiroshima suggest another presence, a dinosaur-like creature named Baragon that goes on to ravage the nearby villages. So we see a battle between the two that ends with the reports of only Frankenstein making it out and waiting for a day to come back again. And he did! in the sequel that we discussed earlier. Now, this project had several concepts behind it, one of the earlier ones being King Kong vs. Prometheus, only for the deals to fall apart. The release of King Kong vs. Godzilla led Toho to consider working with a Frankenstein monster. During one of the stages, the film was supposed to be titled Frankenstein vs. Godzilla, and that's a perfect amalgamation of the US and Japanese studios putting their best, deeply explored monsters front and center. So, in a way, you get that Baragon is supposed to be Godzilla. Anyway, they shifted the tragic origins of Godzilla to Frankenstein and gave us another lesson in the dangers of immoral science, and it did a pretty good job at it too. Dinosaurus, 1960. Before Jurassic Park did it, we got our first take on these prehistoric creatures being restored in this 1960 classic. Once again, we witness an accidental resurrection through a human intrusion arc in which prehistoric creatures are uncovered. And what goes wrong is that they don't adapt to the modern world. The primary creatures are a Tyrannosaurus and a Brontosaurus, both revived into a setting they do not belong in and exhibiting behavior driven purely by instinct. There is a brief moment where we see a caveman having a momentary interaction with them, hinting at the primitive bond, but that arc isn't developed and doesn't go beyond that. So this was indeed a kaiju adjacent film, but it had none of the allegory, and it didn't test the idea of the creature's evolving threat. The Giant Behemoth, 1959. Here comes another entry to the post-war monster cinema that is deeply rooted in the nuclear consequence. Eugene Loret, director of the previously discussed Gorgo film, helmed this project, and the story sees a monster behemoth emerge from the beach just as the threat to marine life from nuclear testing had been mentioned. While the appearance is a mix of marine creature and Godzilla, there's a larger threat this one poses beyond its destructive nature. The monster emits lethal radiation continuously, creating a secondary axis of threat and harming wherever it goes, purely due to its presence. So even though the fear is less on the spectacle of the creature, it's the contamination that feeds right into the atomic age anxieties that labeled radiation as insidious, something that cannot be avoided as it lingers around us. Gapa, the Triphibian Monster, 1967. Another take on the Gorgo story. This one sees humans capturing a baby creature from a remote island only to trigger something completely unexpected. An adult Gapa emerges, and the biggest trait of these creatures is right there in the title of the movie, Triphibian, so they can operate across land, sea, and air. So the Gapa parents arrive and pose as the primary threat here. But what truly comes across as unique here is the manner in which the creature is designed, winged, clawed, and having an avian reptilian approach compared to the general dinosaurian designs. Plus, there are the practical effects that ground the creature physically, with Nikatsu taking the helm as the production house instead of Toho, once again taking on the idea of human intervention and its response, rather than the kaiju method. I'm gonna go and check out some more of these titles, because 10 movies hardly do justice to the impact that Godzilla has had on cinema as a genre. Till next time, bye! Yongari, 1999. Shifting completely from the simulation method, something that was an essential part of the films that started the genre itself. Yongari was a heavy jump into CGI. The South Korean film is once again a reimagining of the 1967 take on the character of Yongari in the film Yongari, Monster of the Deep. Now, another major development in the take on this creature is the idea that it is not at all controlled by what happens in the world, but depends on extraterrestrial control. Exactly. This whole thing just went beyond the world itself. So, even though a dinosaur-like creature is excavated from Southeast Asia, it is awakened by a ray from an alien ship. The creature is controlled through a diamond-shaped receptor on its forehead. In a way, the film mirrors many Heisei-era Godzilla films, where escalation becomes a core theme through which the creature's power is elevated. But it's the CGI, the heavy CGI, a kind that hadn't been perfected yet, making the creature seem almost weightless because the integration with the live action feels artificial. But the ambition here is quite clear: modernize the kaiju form and present it to a global audience. Even though it was an attempt to adapt kaiju-era cinema for a whole new audience, it was surely the early stages of the genre's next step.